This segment is on totalitarian states after World War II. Obviously, during World War II, the Empire of Japan and Nazi Germany were totalitarian states, but this is covering after World War II. So beginning in 1945. Okay, so the first and most important totalitarian state after World War II was the Soviet Union, also known as Russia. Two names are frequently interchangeable at this time, but officially they were called the Soviet Union, and they were a very powerful uh, totalitarian state after World War II. You can see that in red is the Soviet Union up in the right-hand corner of the picture. Very large landmass, and they emerged very powerful after the end of World War II because they were one of the victors. The democracies defeated the Nazis, but also the Soviet Union, which was a dictatorship, was in the war against the Nazis too, and they had a strong military and played a large role too in defeating Nazi Germany. So after the war, the Soviets remained powerful, and this shows the huge landmass they had as a totalitarian communist superpower, one of the two superpowers in the world. Okay, so another picture of the Soviet Union in power after World War II. They were one of the two superpowers. Who was the other? The other superpower was the United States. So the United States and the Soviet Union. Um, but the shocking thing that happened after World War II was many countries thought they were going to be free because now Nazi Germany had been vanquished. But instead of that happening, the Russians or the Soviets took over Poland, East Germany, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Romania, and Bulgaria at the end of World War II and put them into basically an occupied, brutal occupation. So these countries, thinking they were going to be free, ended up now being under the domination of Stalin. And you can see this here doesn't have the names, but this is the Russians have a huge prison system called gulags, and anyone who defied them would be sent to the gulags, including citizens and people from those countries that we just covered, basically in Eastern Europe. Some were sent in slave labor to work um, on building railroads or to work in various gulags and prisons. Uh, in many cases, they were just political prisoners after World War II. This is part of a group who was enslaved by the Soviets after World War II and sent to a gulag. And these are Lithuanians. It's estimated about 300,000 Lithuanians were in prison from their home country, and these people thought they were free when Hitler was defeated, but instead they had to endure another 4 years of being under a different totalitarian power, which was the Soviets. Churchill coined this name. Churchill coined this name the Iron Curtain, meaning that the like the abstract division between Eastern and Western Europe, in which really also began what was called the Cold War, where the United States supported the democracies of Western Europe with money and military supplies after World War II was over, and the Russians used military power and a prison system to basically control Eastern Europe. And so Churchill came up with the name the Iron Curtain, dividing these two areas. Now, um, like I said, the U.S. was the other major power after World War II, was a democracy and a strong, obviously stronger than ever after World War II because of the home front and the victory. So the United States did not want Western Europe to fall to the communists. And so the Marshall Plan here gave aid, like it says, in millions of dollars to, and this is in the textbook, this exact chart. Millions and millions of dollars were given to France and Italy to rebuild because they were devastated during World War II, so now they need to be rebuilt. And part of this is humanitarian, but also there was a strong practical level because America did not want these countries to become part of the Russian orbit and to fall into totalitarian state power. So the Marshall Plan was very successful in rebuilding Europe, like it says in the textbook. Here you see President Truman, remember him after World War II, um, asked for 17 billion actually to restore and secure Western Europe. Okay, so another totalitarian power, there were the two major totalitarian powers, the Soviets and the Chinese. And the Chinese might be a bit of a surprise because they were American allies in World War II. But they fell a few years after the war into communist power. The country completely collapsed, and a communist uh, insurgency took over, and it became a communist superpower, and then became an adversary of the United States. So there was this unexpected twist in history. Here was the communist leader, Mao Zedong. So you see a map here. China is a huge country, not just an extremely large population, but a large amount of land. If you look in the upper right-hand corner, you see Korea is very close to the to China, actually borders China. And if you look at the bottom in green, you see Hanoi, and that would be Vietnam. So both Vietnam and Korea, which were a large part of American history as far as war goes, were very influenced by China as a totalitarian power. Um, Once a U.S. ally, but then became a U.S. enemy. Okay, so you can see here, this is China, now a communist country um, by 1950. And if you see Taiwan there in white box, is an island nation. So those who supported nationalism and to some extent democracy escaped and started a new country in Taiwan. Their leader was Chiang Kai-shek, and America supported him to be a new democracy. You see, there's Taiwan. So Taiwan became basically the part of China that was democratic, and but much smaller, obviously. But it was still where the Free Chinese escaped to, and became a very powerful democracy over time, and still is. So why did China not invade Taiwan? Okay, so one of the reasons is Chiang Kai-shek's wife came to the United States um, and basically asked for the support of America financially and militarily. And she had a very successful tour to the United States. Okay, so this is her, Madam Chiang Kai-shek, visiting the United States, talking to Eleanor Roosevelt, and asking for military support, which she received. And so that country, ever since then, every president of the United States has defended Taiwan's right to exist, beginning with this period in which she played a huge role. another picture of Taiwan. This is more recently Independence Day celebration there. Here you see them, various people holding signs saying Taiwan is not a part of China. They very much want to stay free. Okay, so totalitarian states, we see China began a dictatorship called Korea. North Korea started as a result of Chinese influence. A very brutal regime under North Korea, which you still hear in the news all the time, uh, with the current dictator of North Korea still in the news. Okay. Um, okay, so another place influenced by the communist states is Cuba, and Cuba was taken over after a revolution, in which, in the 50s, um, in which Castro rose to power. And this is a famous standoff after Castro took power, in which the Russians tried to place nuclear missile silos in Cuba, and you can see it's just a few miles off the coast of Florida, 90 miles. So this was a major standoff in the 60s between American ships and Russian ships right off of Cuba, in which John F. Kennedy, the new young president, stood up to the Russian superpower and refused to allow nuclear missiles to be placed on Cuba. Kennedy himself had once, this is when it says Kennedy's son, that's speaking of John F. Kennedy, who had been a hero, basically not a war hero, but in rescuing people during the war, in which he swam out and saved some other sailors. But he eventually became president of the United States. There on the right, John F. Kennedy, one of the most popular presidents in U.S. history. He was the youngest president and the first Catholic president. This is shortly after he became president. Well, here you see a newspaper article, and JFK stood up to the Russians off the coast of Cuba, and the Russians finally pulled their missiles out and pulled their ships out and left. Another notable achievement of JFK. Here you see he's talking about, and one path we shall never choose, the path of surrender. So he was, very eloquent, but also very strong president. Another one of his famous quotes: "Ask not what your country can do for you, ask what you can do for your country." So unfortunately, he was assassinated at a young age in another catastrophe in the era where Martin Luther King was assassinated, and so was Robert Kennedy. But here is one of the thousands of newspaper articles about his assassination. And assassin kills Kennedy. The assassin actually was Lee Harvey Oswald, who had, by the way, just recently before the murder, visited the Soviet Union and had visited Cuba. So that's why there was very much likely ties to the Soviets or to Cuba, which is the most obvious scenario of this assassination. So Kennedy was assassinated, and Lyndon Johnson was sworn in. And then, finally, this is the opposite of a totalitarian state. But Japan, we had talked about in World War II. Interestingly, a great enemy then, but then Japan became a very strong ally of the United States as time went by. And part of that was the MacArthur Constitution, in which General MacArthur began a democracy, allowed them to have voting rights again, and they were a free country, free of that military dictatorship they had once had, and Japan became a free country. And today you see Japan is the third strongest economic power in the world, which was an amazing rise from the rubble of World War II. Okay, so, all right, so we've covered the totalitarian power, and who were they? The major ones was the Soviet Union, communist, and when we say that communist, we're not talking about an economic system. In the case of the Soviet Union, it was a dictatorship, and so it's really more of a political and military term. So the Soviet Union is the one totalitarian power, and the other major one was China. And the Cold War with these powers, with Russia, went on from 1949 to 1989. And as far as China goes, they still exist as a world power, as a world communist power. Okay. All right, and Russia does, but a much less strong than they used to be. Okay.